Hello everyone and welcome to one of the craziest games that happened yesterday. It's a game between Daniil Dubov and Nepomniachtchi, and even though Nepomniachtchi is quite a lot higher rated in classical chess, in rapid chess they are almost identical. It's number 12 for Dubov versus number 9 for Nepomniachtchi, but they are not the highest rated rapid Russian players in the world, as there is also Alexander Grishuk, who is the highest rated, currently number 7 in the world. But still, quite a clash, and the game is just awesome. It has its ups and downs, and it's very unique, as the two of them I think are probably the most exciting players we have nowadays. So without further ado, let's check it out, as we have quite a lot to enjoy in this one. So Dubov with the white pieces opens with e4. We have c5, young goes for the Sicilian defense, knight f3, d6 and d4 now. We have captures, and now knight to f6, knight to c3 and a6. Nepo goes for the Najdorf Sicilian, and here we often say that there are many moves you can play here: bishop e3, bishop g5, bishop e2, bishop c4, a3, a4, h3, h4, g4, like anything goes here. Okay, maybe not g4 right away, but f3, like, and you can play anything here. But here we have f4, so again, something that we haven't seen quite often, so-called Amsterdam variation, and Nepo strikes in the center with e5. We have knight to b3, and now bishop to e7, and here Dubov captures. We have captures, and the queens come off the board. We have queen captures, bishop captures, and now bishop to g5, and already very interesting things will happen. There is one game in the database where bishop to e3 was played in 1977 European Championship between Krunoslav Hulak and Mirza Pavlov, that ended in a draw. But here, after bishop to g5, it is as of move 10 that we have a completely new game. So let's see how Nepo deals with this. He goes knight b to d7, just continues development, and now a4. Preparing to grab more space on the queen side. We have h6, pushing back that bishop, and here not bishop to e3 like in the game we've mentioned, but rather bishop to h4. And now he's basically offering a pawn, because knight captures on e4 is possible. The bishop will be hanging on h4, and this is exactly what Nepo goes for. Knight captures on e4, and now bishop captures on d8. So now if king captures, then knight captures knight. So here knight captures on c3 instead, and now bishop to c7, just getting the bishop out of harm's way, and black does the same. Knight d5 attacks the bishop, and bishop to d6 now. So what Dubov got for his extra pawn, for his pawn sacrifice, is that the king will not be castling for the moment, and he still has the bishop pair. So let's see if this is worth a pawn. However, knight to e3 now comes with the threat of knight captures on c2, and also maybe the bishop will be lost. So here Dubov decides to give up yet another pawn to save the bishop, and to prevent knight captures on c2. So he plays bishop to d3, but now gives up the g2 pawn as well. So Nepo just grabs it, knight captures on g2 with check, king to d2, and now knight to f4. And now again the bishop is under attack, and there's really not all that much you can do here. If you try, there's not much you can try here. You can just waste a few more moves, but that bishop is coming off the board. So he will not be keeping the bishop pair, but it doesn't matter. Rook 8 to g1. Not this rook to g1, rather this rook to g1 going after the pawn, because if g5 you want to have this rook on h file to play h4. So the g7 pawn is under attack, Nepo defends it, and now a5, just grabbing more space on the queen side, and now Nepo takes the bishop off the board. Knight captures on d3, c captures on d3, and now, okay, here maybe you could have captured with the king, but I think Dubov wanted to keep this pawn on d3 to not allow black some really rapid expansion here, so the pawn on d3 will prevent that, even though you usually don't want to mess up your pawn structure. But okay, here we have b6, and this is the really amazing moment, because if you look at the position now, there aren't all that many moves black can play. You cannot move the knight because this pawn falls. You can't play something like f6 to defend the pawn because the g pawn falls. The rooks cannot get into the game. You cannot castle. You can't play rook b8 to push b5. So even though Dubov is down 2 pawns, it doesn't look like Nepo has all that many moves. So here we have b6, preparing to play bishop to b7 and bring the rook to c8. This is probably the only thing black could have done. And rook to c1, just grabbing hold of that c file, going for rook to c7. So Nepo quickly plays bishop to b7, attacks the rook on h1, and now rook h to e1. And now, well, you might think, okay, rook to c8, and we've taken care of all of our problems. Rook to c8 actually loses on the spot. It's not at all clear why, but I will show it. After rook captures with check, bishop captures, we're going to play a captures on b6. Now create a beautiful passed pawn here, and if the passed pawn is captured, then comes bishop captures on e5, attacks the rook, and now there's not much to be done here. You are threatening some nasty discoveries because the rook is aligned with the king, so you might fix both of those threats by castling. Now there's no discovery and the rook is not under attack, but there is bishop to d6, and now the rook is under attack. The rook cannot go here, and if you play this, then just bishop c7 and the white wins. So a very, very tricky position. No doubt Dubov had this in his preparations, as it's very bold to play something like this against Nepo, where you just sacrifice 2 pawns straight out of the opening. But Nepo just plays bishop captures on a5. He just grabs another pawn. So rook to c7 by Dubov, and now bishop to g2. You have to move the bishop. Nepo moves it to g2, and now knight to c5, attacking the knight. So just capturing the knight is the threat. So knight captures on c5. We have knight captures, bishop captures, and now f6. And it seems that Nepo took care of all of his problems, but one very big problem remains: how to develop this rook, because the entire 7th rank is covered, and also what to do with this rook. So it's not all that clear. And Dubov goes for rook to c1, and now he wants to double up rooks on the 7th rank, or as we like to say, promoted them into pigs. So here we have bishop to h3. This is a crucial defensive idea, as you have to cover that c8 square. So here, rook to e7 with check, king to d8, and now rook to g7. So going after those pawns, we have rook to c8, putting pressure on the bishop here. And now, well, you could play bishop to b6 check, king to e8. This does not result in checkmate because that bishop on h3 is guarding the rook. That was the idea behind bishop to h3. However, here Dubov finds another idea. He plays d4 and he sacrifices yet another pawn. Now, what's interesting about this pawn is that it most certainly cannot be captured, but it's not immediately clear why. However, Nepo doesn't believe that, and that's exactly what he goes for. Here, probably you should play something like g5, prevent white from capturing the pawn, but Nepo boldly captures on d4, and now there's a problem. Bishop to b6 check. We have king to e8, and now, okay, we don't have this because the rook is defended, but the e file opened up, and now there's rook to e1 with check. King f8, and now rook to e7. And now we have 2 fully operational pigs here on the 7th, and it's looking extremely scary for black. It's not at all clear how he will even continue playing this. So here, bishop to e6, a very creative move, saying that, okay, I'm not going to allow you any checks here, and if you capture, of course, your rook falls. So rook to a7, getting this rook out of harm's way, and now g5, just defending that pawn. And here, bishop captures on d4. So now, only now will Dubov start collecting the pawns that he so happily sacrificed. And also it guards the b2 pawn, so it makes sense. And here, rook to g8, trying to trade off a pair of rooks, just rook g to e7, not allowing this trade. We have bishop to b3, now with some ideas of maybe rook to c2 check, but just rook e to b7. And now you don't really have the option of delivering some checks because there's too much of that back rank weakness black has to worry about. So here, bishop back to e6, and now rook captures on a6. Again, continuing to collect pawns, attacking the bishop, bishop to f7, and now even rook captures on f7, going after that bishop here. So rook to g7 defending, and now rook captures on h6. So first, Dubov sacrificed all of his pawns, and now he's recollecting them with interest. We have rook to g6, as the rook is now also under attack, so rook to g6, and now rook to h7. Again, attacking the bishop, and now bishop to d5, attacking Dubov's rook here. But now the position is completely winning for white, so feel free to pause the video and win this game for Dubov while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting a most forcing idea. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it's bishop to g7 with check. And now you can see that there's nothing to be done. If the king moves, rook to h8 is checkmate. If the king moves to the left, if king to d8, it's not a problem. Just to rook h8 to check, and after you give up the bishop, this is again checkmate. So obviously the king cannot move. Your only option is to capture the bishop, but then after the bishop is captured, now you just recapture here, and there is no more point in playing this, as the two rooks will of course completely dominate the rook and bishop, and this is a completely winning endgame. However, after this bishop to d5 move, Dubov was extremely low on time for quite some time now, and he's constantly playing at that 10 seconds increment, and he didn't spot bishop g7 check. He played rook b to d7, and now the game continues for a little bit. We have bishop to e6 check, and only now Dubov goes for bishop to g7 check, but now it's different, because now after king to e8 you don't have rook h8 check, because the rook is now on d7, so there's no point in that. So you have to waste the move playing rook to a7, but now rook to d8 with check, king e3, and now rook to d7. Again, finding some safe squares for the king. So now any checks can be met with just moving the king. So here rook a8 check, king to e7, and now even rook captures on a5. So Dubov grabs another pawn, and now he's simply up a pawn, and if he can organize his pieces, maybe those pawns can be pushed to become queens. So bishop to f7, not allowing any discoveries with this bishop. Now bishop to e5. We have rook to e6, putting pressure on the bishop here, and rook to g7. Dubov now ready to collect even more pawns, and now rook to b7. And here you have to be careful. If you capture on g5, then black captures on b2. The bishop on e5 is pinned. So of course Dubov eliminates this threat by playing king f2. Now the bishop is no longer pinned, and now rook to c6. We have bishop to c3, and now rook back to h6, going after the h2 pawn. King g3, Dubov just defends it, and now rook to d7. With some ideas of starting a checking spree here. We have rook to e5 with check, king to f8 attacking the rook here, and now rook g captures on g5. So now Dubov is up two pawns, and Nepo is without any pawns. It's funny how things turn out like that, because Nepo was up like 4 pawns, maybe even 5 at some point, maybe it was 4. But okay, rook to d3 with check, king to f4, and now bishop to e6. And here, a nice mating idea, as the rook cuts off the king completely from the third rank, the bishop covers these squares, and now rook to h4 check will be deadly. You're going to have to block, and then rook captures his game over. So here, rook to e2, making some room for his king on e5, and now rook to h4 with check. King e5, and now rook to d5, again with check. King captures on e6, and now rook captures on g5. And now Dubov failed to take advantage of his great position, and now it's Nepo who's actually up material. But okay, it's still bishop and 2 pawns for a rook, so those pawns could be very scary. We have bishop to f6, attacking both of the rooks, and now rook to g6, pinning the bishop. And now king f5 doesn't work, because you simply play rook h to g4, and you save both of the rooks. So instead, we have rook to d2, now going for rook to d8 checkmate, so you have to prevent this. Rook to e4 with check. Here Dubov goes back, rook e back to g4 by Nepo. Dubov again threatens checkmate, rook to e4 check. King goes back, rook e back to g4. Nepo happy with a draw, but Dubov says nope, we're gonna play on, because I still have 2 passed pawns. So he starts pushing h4. We have rook to g2, offering a trade of rooks. We have rook to d8 with check, king to f7, and now rook to d7 with check. King e8, Nepo just repeating moves. Sorry, I meant to e8, Nepo just repeating moves, and now rook again to d8 with check. King to f7, rook d7 check, king to e8 attacking the rook, and now rook to b7. Again, Dubov declines a 3-fold repetition, so rook to h6. Now just getting the rook out of harm's way. Now this rook can move, this rook will no longer be hanging, and you cannot push h5. So here bishop to g5, attacking the rook, and now rook to f2 check. King g4, and now rook to e6, saying there's no way for you to make progress here. but king h5, and now again rook to f7, offering a rook trade with rook to b8 check, king to d7, and now rook to d8 with check. Dubov has to make moves extremely quickly because for the last 20-30 moves he's been playing with some 30 seconds on the clock, only on increment. So king c6, we have rook to d4 now. And here comes king to c5, chasing back the rook, rook to a4, and now rook to b7, going after the b2 pawn. So here we have rook to a2, but now you can already feel that the white rook being so passive and nothing really happening. It's most likely that white will not be able to do anything here. So king c4, king to g4, we have king to b3, now chasing away the rook, rook a3 check, king captures, and rook to a3 now, offering a trade of rooks. Which Nepo could accept, but he declines first with rook to b4 check, king to h5, and only now he accepts it. Rook captures on e3, bishop captures, and king to c2. And it was in this position that the players agreed to a draw, as this is a very well-known drawn endgame. At some point, the pawn might continue being pushed forward, but the rook can always sacrifice itself for the pawn, and that's just it. There is no way to win this for white. So there were a lot of moments where Dubov could have played better and gone for the win, but with so little time on the clock, and it took him a lot of time to play such tricky chess. But in the end, Nepo is one of the candidates, not just one of the candidates, he's currently leading the candidates tournament with Maxim Vachier-Lagrave, and of course he's as you can imagine, very, very strong, and Dubov was unable to grab a full point here. But really exciting game, and it's what I was expecting when I saw the two of them were playing, and a lot of you have suggested the game, so I thought it was fitting. That's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Here are the standings from the first day. As you can see, Magnus Carlsen in the lead with 4 points, so only lost that one game to Wesley So. Wesley So and Nepomniachtchi with 3.5. Then with 3 we have Maxim Vachier-Lagrave, Anish Giri, Temur Rajabov. Then followed with 2.5 Nakamura, Young Krzysztof Duda, Aronyan, and Sam Shankland. Then with 2 Vidit Gujrati, Alexander Grishchuk, and Daniil Dubov. And then with 1.5 point, Ding Liren and Matthias Blubaum, and in last place, Linier Dominguez, who lost that game to Carlsen we've seen yesterday. But yeah, still early, 2 more days of the preliminaries, and then we go into the main event. So yeah, once again, hope you guys enjoyed this. Really brutal stuff, giving away all those points and then collecting them with interest. Very nicely done. I would like to thank Brian Schofield, Aljosha Paurevic, Mitchell Comans, Raghu Dara, and Austin Del Rio for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the second day of this wonderful event, checking up on your wonderful suggestions and whatever else happens in the chess world. So thank you all, I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.